And so I'm going to pass the mic to Louisa, who's going to introduce our next speaker. Unfortunately, we had car trouble, so that's why our speaker is not here in person. That was the plan, but at lunch we figured it out. And he's here virtually. You'll see his face for a little while, and then we'll just make the screen bigger so you can watch everything, and then we'll kind of go back from there. Questions will be directed through a microphone at the end. Louisa.
So I'm proud to introduce Naresh Agarwal, Associate Professor at Simmons College, where he teaches in areas of technology, web development, knowledge management, and evaluation of information services. Naresh's research area is information behavior and knowledge management, the way people look for information and the contextual factors that impact their choice of information sources. He's held various leadership positions at the Association for Information Science and Technology, NEASIST, the national circuit organization. So we're very happy to have him here at our chapter event.
All right, Naresh, you've got the stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Louisa and Amanda. So I did have car trouble at the last moment, and when I was in the car about to start to join you guys for lunch and then for the talk, but you guys have an extra plate of food today. And so thank you all. My name is Naresh Agarwal. I'm an associate professor at Simmons, now university. It used to be Simmons College until before September last year. And the talk that I'm giving you today is based on a book that I wrote. It's called Exploring Context and Information Behavior. And I did give the same talk at a workshop on data analytics in Paris as well, which was last year. And the reason why I think this is important is because as we talk about data, right, the idea of context comes in as pretty important. And so my talk will be focused more on what this context means as such, because in the form of data, you can think of context as any information that surrounds the use of data. So that is often seen as a kind of a common definition of context when it comes to data analytics. But in this case, we will go deeper into what is context. So my talk will primarily cover the first part of understanding context as it relates to information behavior, human information behavior. And I will leave some time for discussion and some things for you to ponder about as we talk about, to think of how context might apply to research data management. So this was the book, and it was published by Morgan and Claypool. And this is the link for the book, and I think you all should have handouts as well for it. It's Morgan Claypool Publishers, and this is /context over here. So if you think of information behavior, right? Information behavior is what we do on a general basis. Like for instance, sitting on a car to drive and then discovering that that it does not start. Or having lunch and then or figuring out the logistics of how to take the bus to go back to the station right now, or taking notes when someone is speaking, and or talking to people across tables. All of these are basic human activities that we do on a daily basis. And most of the time, whenever a situation arises, there is a need for information. So this morning, so the need for information was for me to see how I could solve the car issue. And a lot of the times, the need for information arises once you are in your job. So you have an assignment to work on, or you are taking classes and you're studying, and then you have some need. And sometimes the need arises in our day-to-day lives as we are going about and we have a curiosity in our mind and we want to know some answers. Often we go to things like we open up our smartphones and go to Google or some other place. And sometimes we ask our friends or colleagues or we text someone or email someone. So all that is a process of looking for information, or this process of seeking. So it might happen, this seeking might happen alone, or it might happen collaboratively with other people. It might happen at work or everyday life. It can happen in person, or it can happen virtually as we connect with someone, like right now, the way I'm connecting with you virtually. And then there is also, apart from seeking, there is the use of information that you find. And sometimes there is also another nuance called avoiding information. And this happens a lot of the times with patients when they're diagnosed with certain disease, they just don't want to deal with it or don't want to find out further until the reality hits. And one research that I'm doing right now is how do people deal with non-response to messages sent over text messages or messages on let's say WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger or non-response to emails or non-response to calls as well. And what happens? Why do people do that? And then how do you deal with non-response? So that's kind of my current area of research on information avoidance and information stopping behavior. And then in this whole gamut of information behavior, there are other things like serendipity. When you encounter information serendipitously, when you're not really looking for it. So if we think of ourselves as an actor or a user, and this person could be a knowledge worker, could be a data analyst, it could be a working person or a student, could even be a child or a toddler. And Brenda Derwin calls such a person a body, mind, heart, spirit moving through time and space, a past history, present reality, and future dreams or ambitions. So this person in the scheme of a day-to-day life has some need for information, might start this process of seeking, could be from people in the library at the reference desk, or could be from friends and colleagues, and we also search for information through computer-based systems or from our smartphones, and sometimes we find information serendipitously. So all of that information that comes through us, we get that information, we try to make sense of it, and that whole process is known as sense making. And it's sort of trying to fill a gap in our minds. There's a lot of confusion, a lot of doubt, and a lot of questions that we might have. And as we get this information, some of that gap gets filled, and then new questions arise, and we go to Google again, and we refine our search, and sort of we continue our search process. And at some point, we might give up, not because all our answers are found, but we might think that that's what we know is enough for now, and then we also avoid information. So all of these, in totality, can be seen as information behavior. And context is here the area that gives rise to the need for information. So the surrounding or the environment, or what are the things under which the need arises, that could be seen as context. But we'll look at more definitions of what context might mean. So the search for context in my case started a long time ago when I was doing my PhD at the National University of Singapore, and at that time also I was doing a research study looking at the information behavior of knowledge workers, and when I was looking at this question of context, right, I found that as I got deeper and deeper into it, it had many layers to it. It was like peeling onions. So why is context really important? So if we did not take context into consideration, then we could assume that everyone or everything behaves in a particular manner. It's like attempting to paint something with a broad stroke of color without really going into nuances or conditions under which certain things happen. So even when we look at people's behavior, and when we look at data, these conditions under which things occur, and things under which they are different, these can be lost. And we find that people don't behave in the same way all the time. So every situation is unique, and which involves different people, different surroundings, and a different series of events. Our behavior is predicted by factors which are often outside our control, like the car breaking down at the last moment, which is just one factor. So that is where the idea of context becoming important comes in. So if we did not take context into consideration, then you would find that everyone or everything is the same. And to some extent, even when we find within the field of information seeking behavior as well, when we say that, okay, information behavior of doctors, or information behavior of lawyers, information behavior of library and information science students, we try to club people into some sort of a category, and which I find as slightly problematic, because even the same person within a certain job or a certain profile or a profession behaves differently from other people in that profile, and the same person might also behave differently at different times of the day, or when confronted with different types of information or situations. And so that is why it's not there are differences, and that's where context helps us understand that. So then, what really is context? So the most common definition of context is really looking at context as some sort of an environment or a container, which is like aspects of a person's life or work role that would influence why a person is looking for information, and the degree to which that person would be satisfied with a particular answer. So again, when you think of like when I'm sitting here right now on this chair, everything that surrounds me is the context. And when I'm looking at you talking over there right now in Worcester, so the room that you're in, the space that you're in, the tables around which you're sitting, that can be seen as some sort of a setting or a context that you're in. So is that the context that is something to ponder about? And the earlier definition of context in data analytics that I mentioned to you was context surrounding the use of data. So that is also from this definition of context. But then some other people say that context is a setting. So the setting here means it can be a socially defined setting in which information is found. For example, a work setting, or an office, or a factory, or a school, or a library, or an archive, or a museum. All of these are different kinds of settings under which we can say that that is context. And some people think that context is a role. So if you are a doctor or a graduate or even a cyclist or a data analyst, all of these are different roles that people take on. So is context a role that a person has, right? So to recap a little bit, when you're looking at these definitions, right, we are actually going at and trying to understand what this word here means. What is this word context means under which this person has this need for information, and then starts his process of seeking, and then finds answers to the information, and then continues the search and gives up at some point. So what does that context really mean is what we're trying to see from this person's point of view. And that is where this idea of is the context the setting that person has, or the role the person, a particular surrounding or a setting or a role, is that what context is? And some people say that context is something that happens to people, like a situation that we get thrown in at a certain point in time, and not because you have to, not because you want to, because sometimes you have to, and then a situation is you're thrown into a certain situation, and then you sort of deal with it. And another definition of context can be seen as an actor's mind, which is the aspects of a person's mental or a physical state, a disposition or intentions, identity as well. Identity is kind of a big loaded word in terms of how we see ourselves to be. And sometimes we associate people's identities are different. So all of these things which go inside my mind, or sometimes the recent experiences of an actor that bear upon how he or she interprets, understands, acts within a certain situation, or what the person notices. So all of these things that go inside my mind. So is that context? So then the difference is, like, there's a group of people which say that context is what is in my mind right now. So even though this chair is outside of me, but I might think that not independently of what this chair is, but what I think of this chair is what makes it important. Like, is what I think of it rather than it existing separately or outside of me. And other people see it as context as something external. So the actor is here, right? And there's the surrounding of the actor. So here context is seen as something surrounding or something outside of the actor. But when you think of context as the actor's mind, so in that case, the context is something that is within the person and not outside of the person. And these kinds of ideas of context will also come in when a person will walk into the library asking you questions about looking for a certain book or a resource. And oftentimes the reference librarian or the person in the library will try to help the person, but then you really don't understand what the context of that need is. And then that is where you're trying to understand this as in terms of where the need is coming from. And some people say that context is the information sources or channels. So information sources could be other people that we are looking for information from. It could be be books or periodicals, or it could be it could be other channels of communication, like smartphones or tablets. So all of these could also be seen as context. And also even when you think of reaching out to a person, right? The source is the person you reach out to, but then you might have different ways of reaching out to that same source, either face to face or electronically or calling or through email and so on. So that is a channel of communication with that particular source. And then is context a constraint? constraint is sort of a host of factors external to the behavior itself that influences the selection of strategies that people employ to find information, which can be individual differences or situational factors that act concurrently to constrain the individual or group behavior. So a lot of times, even though you might want to, you might know that this person has the right information that I need, but that person is, let's say, that too far away from you, and you don't have access to the person. So then, in that case, you're limited by the accessibility. And sometimes, even though you have access and you can reach out to the person, if the person also knows a lot, but then you don't have a comfortable relationship with the person, so you don't reach out to the person because there's a lack of comfort with that particular source. Or if it's a particular book, there's a lack of familiarity with the book or a subject. So there could be various types of constraints that are there in this process of seeking. So is that the context then? And some people say that context is some sort of a discourse or a dialogue that we have with people, and in the process of the dialogue, we try to reach some common ground. So the actor's social interaction and the dialogue helps shape large part of the actor's social information behavior. So something that determines if a conversation or information sharing or collaboration is successful or not. It all depends on the degree to which the parties share some common ground. That is how much they understand each other. So common ground is something that we often assume as given in our social interactions, but it's also something that we intuitively work at through verbal and through non-verbal language, through smiles, through text, through messaging, through emoticons, acknowledging, emotionally reaching out, etc. And some people say that context is assigned meanings during interaction. This can arise from activity or task, something that isn't just there. Like when we see context as a setting, container, or environment, that which surrounds, but is actively produced, maintained, and enacted in the course of the activity. So to understand this part, right, think of it as when we say context is something which is there, so let's say the context of a librarian or a context of people in a room listening to a talk which is being projected on the screen. So is that a given all the time, or is context actually produced and maintained? So let's say that while you're sitting on your chairs right now listening to me, that is your particular need for information, or you're processing some information in your minds right now, maybe taking some information, rejecting some of it, or trying to make sense of some of it. And so that is happening at this particular point in time as you're interacting with information or as you're listening to me. But when you are on your phones trying to find directions on how to go back home, then you'll have a different context at that point. When you're in the evenings trying to have dinner with your family, you'll have a different context. So there is in this case, according to this definition, context is not something which is there as a given, but something that is actively produced depending on the interaction that you have at different points in time with different devices or with different people or with different forms of information. And also something interesting is that context is something that also is about something mobile, which is changing. So let's say this idea of embodiment comes in. So when there's a child which is interacting with an iPad and sitting on a swing, right? So the child is on a swing, which is an external environment, but then the child's mind is engaged with the iPad. So when that same child goes and lies down on a bed, so the external environment has changed, but the iPad environment is still the same. So in that case, you're able to walk around with your context in some manner. So let's say there's a person who's just getting out of the airport and is talking to someone. So within the airport, there's a certain context of the environment, but as the person walks out and boards a taxi to go back home, then the environment changes. So the physical context of the surrounding changes at that point, but the person you engage with, that part still might be the same because you're sort of carrying that along with you. So in that case, now context is something that is changing rapidly as well. It's not something that is fixed at a given point in time. So then the next thing that I looked at, apart from trying to look at what are the various ways in which people understand context, is the boundary of context. So what is context and what is not context? In that case, if we say that all of these different people are saying something, that context is in my mind versus some context is something around me. So the question comes in that which of these people is speaking the truth? Somebody must be lying in terms of what context really is. And if there are these various ways of thinking what is context. So then I came up to this part of this boundary of context. And here, context can be seen as a set of things, factors, elements, and attributes that are related to an entity in important ways, but are not so closely related to the entity that they are considered to be exclusively part of the entity itself. So in this case, the entity is the user or the person looking for information that we had. When you think in terms of data, right, big data or data analytics, you would think of the entity as the data in your case. So all the things which are related to that data or to the person in some manner can be seen as context, but not so related that it is that person or the entity or the data itself. So something which is related very closely there, but not that person. That's one definition of context. And other people have said that the boundary between the context entity and the context is continually negotiated and renegotiated. And context is of the actor engaged in an activity at the point of interaction. So in this case, as you engage with something, then your context is actually produced. So as per these definitions, the boundary between the context and the actor, and the boundary between the content and the context, or the boundary between the actor and the context, is pragmatic, permeable, and revisable. So the question that comes in is that, does context determine my behavior? So the way I am talking to you right now, the way you're listening to me, is this behavior determined by the context I am in, or does the behavior determine the context? So like, does context influence the behavior, or does the behavior influence the context? That or both of it. So that's some part of what's the relationship between the content and the context. So there were these three primary views of context. One is looking at context as a container or something which is external. One is something which is in my mind, something which is a constructed meaning, and one is context which is actually produced in the time of talking to someone, or through dialogue or through interaction. So these are three primary ways of looking at context, which I call the view of context. In the first view, context can be seen as positivist or objective, which is there, which is stable, it's outside of me. And in data analytics as well, this is a view which might apply most often, where data is the entity and or outside of the actor in information behavior. And in this other case, context is inside of me, which is actually produced at the point of interaction, which is a relational property. So what I found was that each of these views is actually correct, rather than saying that only one of these is correct. It is more of how we choose to look at it. So there's a story of 6 blind men and the elephant, and then they go about trying to feel the elephant, and there's one person who goes and feels the trunk of the elephant and says that, oh, this trunk, this elephant is like a snake or something. Some person feels the tail of the elephant and says that the elephant is nothing but a rope. And some person feels the leg of the elephant and says that, oh, this elephant is a tree. So they all look at different things, and they feel that is the elephant, and that's what I try to paint in the cover of the book as well. But in this case, right? So each of these are different views of context. It is a question of who is looking, and that is what will make the difference. So if I am a researcher or a person trying to study another person's context, so this is the view that I'll most often see. That I see the user as a person, and I see the context as something that is surrounding that person. But when I see as myself, when I'm trying to study my own context, then often I would look at context as something which I construe or make in my own mind. So as seen from my view as from my mind, then context is something that is a meaning that I create in my mind, and it's both socially defined context as well. And that is again something as depending on the settings that I feel I'm a part of, or depending on how I see my identity, so that will also shape how I see context. So there is this theory which is called the social identity theory, and according to this theory, right, there are people who are we tend to see that people who feel are a part of a group, we try to say that, okay, these are people within a group, and other people we tend to stereotype. We try to see them based on the culture or the community we think they belong to, or the country they come from, or the profession they have, or something based on race or gender, or a sexual orientation, or some other stereotype that we try to often see people that we do not know well about. So according to social identity theories, there is this process of stereotyping that happens. So which can be based on these various types of nuances. So we are in a haste to look for general types and to overlook individuals. So when we look at the boundary of context, right, I try to come up with this various views of context based on the social identity theory. So if I'm looking at my own context from my point of view, then in that case, context is the meaning that I construe or create. So here, this is me as a person, and here these are the groups that I belong to, and I feel a kinship with these groups, and also some other types of information sources which I'm familiar with. So those things that I'm familiar with, I see them as various circles that I'm a part of, and I see this as my context. And people that I don't understand, and people who are outside of me, and information sources that are outside of me as well, I tend to stereotype those people. And this can be seen as a personal view of context, which is context as constructed meaning, as which is the I in context. And a socially constructed context happens when we collaboratively look for information. So there is a shared context between two people. Let's say I'm collaborating with someone on some research. Then we both have a context. We have our own individual views of our own personal contexts, and we also have a shared context between which we share between some sort of a kinship. Like all the people who are here in this room, interested, associated with ASIST in some manner, or associated with the information profession in some manner, or interested in attending, let's say talks and workshops. So that's some sort of a common context between all of us in this room right now. So then when we have that sort of common kinship is there, and there are people that we don't understand, and those are people that we tend to stereotype. So that's a we in context. And then context as a container is when we're trying to see the context of other people, the he, she, or the they in context. Looking at, in that case, we can see them as individuals or as groups, and even as people who we try to understand a little bit as we go and do ethnographic studies or interview studies in some manner. And we try to understand them a little bit, but there's still a degree of stereotyping that happens. So
Hey, Naresh, sorry to interrupt. You've got about 10 more minutes. Would you like to engage in some of the discussion part as well, or?
yes, I'll come to it. I think I'll try to finish this, and then I'll come to the discussion part. So then the next part comes in trying to look at the elements of context. What are parts of the whole that make up context? So then I found that whenever as we look at these three views of context, the personal view, the stereotype view, and the shared view, there are these various entities which we can see as making up context. The actor as a person, as well as the actor's environment or the surrounding, the task or the activity the person is engaged in, the need for information, the source or the channel that a person reaches out to for information, the relationship shared by the actor and the source, as well as time and space. All of these are different dimensions or facets of context. And we can place these context elements within various levels. So in this case, we can see this actor engaged in an information need. There's some task or activity as the task is there, and this task often arises because of some environment. And then you start looking for information from some source or a channel. And depending on how familiar you are with the source or the channel, if you think that you really know the person well, then you tend to see that person as part of a shared context. The person you look for information from. If you don't understand the person well, then you tend to stereotype those people or even those information sources. So I'm trying to place those elements in one particular view of context over here. And then there are various variables as well, which are found from the literature in terms of where people have tried to understand context. So there, in the type of environment, the type of task, need the trigger, the demographic of the actors, type variables to do with the source or channel of the actor source, as well as things to do with time and space. And then based on these, I came up with a definition of context. So the context of an actor's information behavior consists of elements such as environment, task, actor source, relationship, etc., that are relevant to their behavior during the course of interaction and vary based on magnitude, dynamism, patterns, and combinations, and that appear differently to the actor than to others, or make an in-group and out-group differentiation of these elements depending on the individual and shared identities of those people or of the actor. So this was you'll understand this better if you look at the book, because it follows in a much more systematic manner in the book. And there are other parts in the book which I don't cover here in terms of the literature review and designing studies based on context, and how does context overlap with other things and so on, because I do want to get onto the discussion part. So the discussion part that I want to mention is that does context matter in research data management? So as we think of analytics and big data, right, we're concerned with finding meaningful patterns and knowledge in data that has been recorded. So some questions to consider is that what is the right model of context for data, and what should context capture? What is the architecture of context services? how to address data integration when bringing in context from various systems, can context provide value without violating privacy, and what are the right user experience and interaction models for interaction with context, and how should context be governed? So these are some questions to ponder that I want to leave you with in terms of context as it applies to data and data analytics. And some of these questions were also considered in the workshop on data analytics that I attended in Paris. So I'd want to open myself up for questions at this stage. Yep, and there is this link for the book as well. And I had brought 5 copies, but I didn't come in person, so I'm not there now. I was supposed to carry them, and so the publisher has given some discount so if any of you wanted to get the book, you can go to this link and then enter the code NEASIST, so you'll get a 25% discount. And there's the ebook as well as the paperback. But let's go down to the discussion part now. In terms, if you have any questions at this stage, I'd be happy to take those first.
Hold on.
Yeah.
I just was curious, how do you feel context affects the evaluation of the data? If you could expand upon that.
Yes, so when you think of how does context, so the question, as I understand, is that how does context apply to evaluation of data, right? So in this case, again, the question then comes in terms of what is context, right? So in terms of understanding of what is context as it relates to data, then this view of context would be most applicable, where we see context as something surrounding, right? Because here we can see data in this case as this person or as an entity in that case. So the context is all the information about the data, all the information surrounding the use of the data can be seen as context in this case. So when we're trying to evaluate, you have to look at who was the person who first gathered the data, and what were the conditions under which the data was gathered? What was the research study that was done? For instance, who were the people that were connected with when the data was gathered? Like, how was the information gathered? Which was the university or the body or the IRB institution that approved the data? Was there some funding sources? Were there incentives that were given to data or not? Was the data gathered under? Were people coerced into giving the information? Was the data biased or not? And can you trust the data? All of these questions as they come surrounding the data, all of these can be seen as context. Also, a lot of the times now in research, you find that there is a mandate to share the data that has, along with the research studies that are there. So again, how much of data has been shared? Is the data clean enough or not? Was it cleaned manually? Was it cleaned using some tool? And was the data gathered individually or collaboratively? All of these can be collectively seen as context surrounding the use of the data. It doesn't make sense. And then, as we're trying to get the more context you get, the more information you have. And then that question of privacy comes in, is in terms of can context provide value without violating privacy? So I think a big question that comes in this use of data is that how do you gather enough context to have meaningful use of the data that you have, and also make sure that you are not putting people from where you gather the data into risk. And these questions, these ethical questions, I think become very, very important when it comes to looking at context as it applies to data analytics.
Any other questions?
And I'd also want to know some of your thoughts on some of these questions, if you have some thoughts on how we might.
Perfect that you said that, Naresh, because this morning we had a really interesting talk from Claire Lovdell, who I'm sneaking up on now, because Claire gave us a really great talk about privacy, and so I wanted to pose that same question to Claire. That's in very small writing in the slide. Can context provide value without harming privacy? Is that it?
Yes. Yeah.
Sure. I think, again, I think it depends on the context, right? Is that too much of a cop-out? I don't actually have a good quick answer here. If anyone else has a clever thought on this.
So obviously a lot of institutions or the people who provide funding, and they have their own standards for what they want to see in research data management. I guess the use of context would be to, I guess, go outside of just the paperwork and the bureaucracy and sort of the kind of boxes you have to check out. I mean, I would be interested more in how context helps us supplant what are already the established practices in research data management as it comes to assuring it or security and proper preservation, which I guess relate to privacy and this ethical questions. So what is the extra that one can gain by thinking about context? Because there's already like a lot of standards out there that people follow.
Yes, thank you. And I think one thing that I wanted to share here was that go back to one of my earlier slides, because it has something which would yes, this slide, I think this would apply very well to this idea of context in data analytics, because here it tries to explain what all do we mean by context. So the context you can see as the environment surrounding the data, and all of this environment has these kinds of various elements or these various variables which we can see as context. And then you have the actor. In this case, the actor is the data itself, which is the entity. And all the information about the data can be seen as things that are the context for that data. So if you look at many of these variables, right, these would give us kind of not everything might apply to data, because these are written from the point of view of an actor engaged in information behavior. So the same can be mapped to looking at what are the variables from here which apply to data, and then to see which of these variables are most applicable in terms of trying to look at it in terms of the analysis part of data. And privacy would again be one of the contextual factors or one aspect of context. And in this case, you're actually looking at the actor again is another entity in a way that is engaged with the data. That is the person or the researcher that is there. Could be an actor. It could be the people from whom you've gathered data. That is one actor. It could be the people who are affected by the results of the data. That could be other entities. So again, even in questions of privacy, it comes as the privacy of who. So most of the time, I think it would be the privacy of the people whose data we are analyzing or we are looking at. That is where the question of privacy comes in. So every time when we think of this question of context, right, we also have to look at which of the contextual variables are we talking about, and then we will be able to better answer some of those questions as to which we think we are trying to apply in the case of our data. Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts on this?
I actually had one more thought on this. Not so much with the type of information seeking behavior that people do in libraries, but I just read an article about how, more with online advertising, but it's related to our information seeking behavior, because the advertising that you see when you go online is related to your information seeking behavior if you're using a browser or search engine that tracks you across sites. But it was a study that showed that people were less likely to purchase things that were hyper-specific to them, actually. Like it was counterintuitive, like the creepiness factor of being advertised something that you looked at 5 sites ago actually decreased your likelihood to purchase it, which I think would mean that in this instance, context would be like negative, like would negatively impact whoever's thinking about it, in terms of the companies that are thinking.
Yeah, I couldn't hear you very clearly, but what I got was that when you look at a certain advertisement and people are negatively inclined to buy that, is that what you're saying? Was that in the article you read?
Yeah, when it's when the online advertising is hyper specific to your search history, you're actually less likely to purchase it. Whereas advertising that's based more on aggregate data is more likely to result in a purchase. And I wish I could remember where I saw this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Librarian, surely someone is going to find this, right? Find it and tweet it, please.
Yes, and I do want to talk about a little bit on this, because what's happening now is that we are living in terms of information bubbles, and in information bubbles, what's happening is that most of the time, even in terms of the political leanings that we have, we tend to only see those kinds of news sources or things that we are interested in, and we kind of become more and more like what we already are, and we don't see things outside of us. And as we try to provide more value added services, or more personalized services, or more targeted ads in the case of advertisement you're talking about, right? Then we tend to go deeper and deeper into the information bubbles that we already are in. And that is where this idea of serendipity becomes more important, because information encountering, which happens when you walk into a bookstore, or even when you walk into the library, is that often you go and look at books which you have not really thought about, and that sort of makes you curious, and we start looking at it, right? Or even when you go and browse for websites just out of links, and you find something interesting. So that sort of room for serendipity is really actually very important to our creativity and innovation. And the more we try to personalize and target things and people, and the more we try to sort of put people into some sort of a template format, the room for serendipity really goes away. And that is why serendipity and information encountering is really important to have that nuance, and to have things which are outside our areas of expertise, outside of interest, because that is the part where we really learn, and that is where some new thoughts and new ideas are created. So I think even in terms of context, right, as it applies to data, there could be context in terms of where the data came from. I think that part would be there as a given, right? But where the data could be applied, that part could be much more innovative, or much more serendipitous. So sometimes people who generate a certain amount of data, let's say, might publish in a certain targeted journals, or might make the data available to certain kinds of audience. But people who are totally unrelated could also make use of that in different ways, if there were more avenues in terms of reaching out to them in a case. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Naresh. Let's give a round of applause. Thank you very much. And the slides will be available for anyone who wants to look at them as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.